Most people have a very limited historical vocabulary. What I mean by that is that if an American politician was trying to convey a point that our current era is like another era, and thus why we should support his agenda and give him our votes, he can only really pull on the US Civil War, the American Revolution, World War II, and then anything since the 60s or in living memory. However, for all of these, they're incredibly recent by historical standards, with the American Revolution, the oldest, being only 250 years ago. As I've said in many other videos, there are multiple cycles of history, with one being around 100 years-ish, the other being around 200 to 300 years, and the largest being over 2,000. This means that a society with a social historical framework that's as short as ours is blinding itself to the full color palette of history, but through that, also what could happen in the future. This point may sound unimportant, but keep listening and you'll find it takes on a much more profound meaning than I think a lot of you can imagine. As I've covered in previous videos, unlike our politicians and pop culture figures who can only compare our society to World War II or the 60s, I find the most telling parallels to our current age being the fall of the Roman Republic, which I cover through this video, the French Revolution, which I cover in this video, and finally the 1600s, which this video is about. Through this video, you'll find our cultural, political, religious, and economics bear a shocking similarity to those of the 1630s. We're also seeing war turn back to that time period as well. If the US and China fight a war today, or even Russia and Turkey, it will bear much more resemblance to the 30 Years' War than World War II. Historians centuries from now would be completely justified in calling the wars ripping across the Middle East that have been going on for decades as the Islamic 30 Years' War. Hi gang, before we get started, please let me have a shameless plug. You all should check out my podcast Common Ground, which is on a separate channel so as to not mess up the algorithm. We've brought on guests such as the Libertarian presidential candidate, the author of Ender's Game, and the CEO of a large geopolitics consulting firm, and have interesting conversations about the future of society. Check it out, and have a great day. There's a really fun book named 1632, which is about a small American town from West Virginia being teleported back into the middle of Germany during the 30 Years' War. It's really a blast to read, and I think it would jive really well with the show's target audience. But one of the really fascinating points it makes is how modern people were in the 1600s. What I mean by that is if you were to time travel back to the Babylonians or India at the time of Buddha, and came in a time travel machine or a car like Back to the Future, you would struggle to explain the concept of what a machine was. Remember, this is a society without windmills, clocks, or the compass. The idea of using machinery to achieve incredible results that the human body can't would be totally alien to their society. These are societies that viewed everything in the world as a god or spirit whose favor you should court. The idea that the universe was based off impersonal laws that you should study objectively would seem bizarre and stupid to most cultures in history. However, the people of the 1600s had the same toolkit as we do today. They had the scientific method, political science, or physics. A crazy point to make is that the 1600s were an era with very low temperatures, which we call the mini ice age. The thing is that Europeans were advanced enough to realize that this mini ice age was caused by a minor reduction in solar flares from the sun during the 1600s. This is the same time period as in which witch burnings were considered common sense in the law. In the book 1632, when the inhabitants of 17th century Europe saw cars, advanced rifles, and more, they completely understood how they worked on a basic level, and their scientists start to deconstruct them. The point I'm trying to make in a roundabout way is that for us today, it's easy to think that the 1600s were incredibly distant, inhabited by people that were barbarians. But the reality is that these were people who were by all accounts pretty similar to us today. If you put someone from 1640 on a Zoom call, except for the accent, you could understand each other pretty well, and the cultural barrier would be significantly smaller than a lot of countries in the world today like China or Zambia. When we talk about these events in the 1600s, these are modern people, put in different incentive structures from what we're used to, but the fundamental reality is that we'll end up with similar problems if we're put in a similar position, and are we really going to act so differently? The 1600s is one of my favorite eras of history, and I wonder if that will bleed into the production of this video. This is a handmade watercolor map I made of the world in 1644, just as an example. Part of the reason that I like it is that it's right on the border of the uncanny and the understandable. It's stuck halfway between witch burnings and modern science. However, as we'll see, even some of the things that seem bizarre from the 17th century still exist in ways that you'll probably overlook. There are a series of remarkable similarities between our world and that of the 17th century. When I explain why the wars of the near future will be fought like the 1600s, one of the biggest reasons is that we now have a society in many ways that behaved like one in the 1600s, thus the military and political realities mirror back the culture. An example that I'm sure many fans of this show anticipate is that the 1600s were facing a secular crisis in the same way we are today. For those that don't know, secular crises are social, economic, and political crises that occur roughly every 200 to 300 years, and we're now facing all the signs of which today. Peter Turchin has computer models that predict said secular cycles, in which the two dominant variables that predict it are inequality and average wages. There are also numerous other predictors such as height, average age of marriage, and more. As I talk about in this video, what happens is that over periods of stability, the labor pool grows, thus opportunities diminish and the cost of living goes up, which then drives up inequality. This then breeds political radicalism, which destroys the system, thus causing political unrest and the system to reset. Turchin's computer models use these variables to predict political historical crises such as the fall of the Roman Republic, the Black Death, the French Revolution, and yes, the religious wars of the 17th century to the years they actually took place in. His computer model in 2010 said America, and the rest of the world by extension, was doomed to a crisis like this in the 2020s. The world before secular cycles are pretty similar every time. For first, the average person is poor, inflation is bad, as is the economy, wealthy elites have used the state to capture the society for their benefit. A few are dazzlingly wealthy, while even the upper middle class struggles with rife competition for work. The society is divided politically and looks to be upon the verge of civil war. It also looks as if international conflict's going to break out any second, and messianic theories that the world is at the end are popular, as is political and religious fanaticism. In the 1600s, everything I just described was occurring almost everywhere in the world. Someone did a calculation for 17th century England, which, by the way, was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and it wasn't uncommon for people to work themselves to death, since the calories they made from working didn't balance out the calories they expended doing the hard farm or crafts work that was common in that era. One of the things people just don't believe, but which is still true, is that the average age of marriage has stayed constant in the West for 1,000 years. In the good times, like in the 1400s or in the early 1700s, people would get married at age 20. And you know what? In 1950, the average age of marriage was 20, and as late as 1970, it was 22. Meanwhile, in the harsh times of the 1600s, people got married at age 28, and now the average age of marriage is 30. We cope today that the reason people marry later is due to feminism in college, but the reality is people just can't afford to. One of the points I continually try to hammer home in these videos is that people are biological animals, and when they can't pass on their genes by marrying certain families, they go crazy and start political crises. This is true both today and in the 1600s. People often scoff at the religious fanaticism of the 1600s, but that always gives me a chuckle, since they lack so little self-awareness. I grew up in the wake of the War on Terror, where I could often hear, "Why can't the Sunnis and Shias just get along?" or Bill Maher saying, "Religion causes war," and then 10 years later, people are willing to kill each other over the differences politically between the right and the left. Part of the reason is that people think people wage war over the reasons they say they do. So if, let's say, they're fighting a war over religion, if you remove religion, there's no longer going to be a war. The reality is that war, not peace, is normal over history and is really constant. And people will always wage war, and they just happen to justify war with whatever matters to them at the time, whether nationalism, the god of the trees, Catholicism, or trans people. Also, why is dying over religion silly, but dying for political ideologies isn't? Communism has killed more people than every other religion and ideology in history combined, and that's dying over an economic system, while the Taliban is dying over what they believe to be the most basic nature of the cosmos. There's zero self-awareness that politics has just become the new religion. The right and the left today offer different views of the human race, the universe, and how to behave societally and on a personal basis, which is the definition of a religion. As I argue in this video, religion and political ideology are completely indistinguishable from an outside perspective, and also that the modern left is in reality an Abrahamic religion in the tradition of Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, and none of its views make sense without that lineage. Both today and in the 1600s, the world was divided by religious conflict. In the modern West, this is between the left and the right, and in the 1600s, it was Protestants and Catholics. In the same way that the right and left divided across families, workplaces, and neighborhoods today, so did the Protestant and Catholic divide. It was common to hear stories in the 1600s of brothers stumbling across each other on opposite sides of the battlefield. There are some funny lines of dissent going on, like both the Protestants and Catholics, or the left and the right, are really about how much influence political authority should have over religion. Alternately, you can predict wokeness geographically based off the areas that were Calvinist in the 1600s. You see on both the radical right and left traditional aspects of religious fundamentalism, especially common among the Abrahamics. These include taboos on food consumption, dislike of sexual imagery, usage of certain sacred words, driving out dissenters from sacred organizations, or banning dissenting books. We laugh at the Puritans who banned Christmas in 17th century England, or the Anabaptists in North Germany who were at the end of the world, tried polygamy and then communism, and you look at North Europe today, which is killing its economy and society through climate initiatives, New York City banning wood-fired pizzas, or Chaz descending into chaos. An important similarity between today and the early modern period is the effects of the creation of information technologies. Back in the early modern period, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and for the next 150 years, that quaked across the European continent. Because information could be produced so much more cheaply, it meant that normal people started reading the Bible and comparing the Bible with how the Catholic Church practiced religion. They started to notice inconsistencies. What you see with both the university system before the internet and the Catholic Church before the printing press is, due to the centralization of information, a single social class maintains control over the dissemination of information, and because they share a singular class interest, you see them avoiding and actively blocking information which they believe will hurt the public and promote dangerous radicalism, but at the same time blocks some what are seemingly obvious truths. And then what happens when the general public gains access to that information, looks through it, they'll start to think, wait, you guys weren't telling us the whole truth, and thus you see the loss of trust in traditional institutions such as academia and the Catholic Church, and a coming ideological rift. With both the New Right and Protestantism, which emerged through the dissemination of information, you saw an ideological counter to the old order. And also, in the same way as Protestantism, among the New Right, you see lots of ideological diversity and different sects, that some of which are incredibly radical and some of which are more moderate, and they're unified by their dislike of the old university system and the Catholic Church. And you see disagreements over sacred topics, in our case being things such as gender, race, sex, etc., in which the Protestants or the New Right look through the original source material, being actual scientific data or the Bible, to disagree with established authorities. In both cases, the new dissidents were completely dependent upon the new form of technology, which I see with the New Right being almost entirely disseminated through the internet, and this then causing large political crises about how society should move forward. The other strong continuing thread between the 17th century and today is globalization. We forget that globalization has been occurring for centuries, and we've seen many of the problems we face today before in history. The Spanish ran a giant global empire that they were attempting to maintain, fighting against countless opponents. They pulled large amounts of silver from Bolivia. This silver then flooded the European economy, creating large amounts of inflation, which drove down the wages of the average person, pushing them into poverty. This destroyed the economy of Mediterranean Europe permanently. Where have we seen globalization lowering wages before? Spanish silver and gold held the world together. When Spain fell into a recession during the 30 Years' War, it produced a financial crisis crisis, which went across the whole world, destroying the Ming Dynasty in China, since their economy was dependent upon Spanish gold. It's the same way today, where the world's economy is so weak and interconnected that if one of the world's major economies goes down, all the others will, in a giant global crisis. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it cut the world off from Russian oil and grain, which has caused skyrocketing prices for both across much of the world, especially Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. This will likely cause major political problems. We can see the same sort of thing with how when Poland-Lithuania, Europe's breadbasket at the time, was cut off from Western Europe due to political problems in Denmark, it caused mass famine throughout Western Europe, plunging England and France into civil war. This is a problem that has the potential to be far worse in our time, as much of the world is completely dependent upon food and fertilizer imported thousands of miles by unstable countries that can easily fall apart. Globalization operates under similar principles no matter when it occurs. When you look at cheap workers replacing native workers, you've got the African slave trade. When you look at foreign competition causing deindustrialization, you have the Dutch being so much more advanced financially that they caused deindustrialization among neighboring countries, which then sparked a trade war and literal wars with England, almost like the US-Chinese trade wars today. In both the 1600s and today, a globalized world stood on the edge of crisis at the same time. I often talk in this show about how everywhere in the world is set to have a major political crisis now, whether the US, Europe, Russia, China, the Middle East, or Brazil. The regimes are barely holding on to power, and a major crisis elsewhere will precipitate global stresses that will cause the whole world to burn down. In the 17th century, the world crisis started in Germany in 1618, with the battle between Protestants and Catholics. This war, which was later called the 30 Years' War, burned for 30 years and dragged in almost every country into Europe into it. The countries not involved in the 30 Years' War, or distantly involved, such as Britain, Poland, Russia, or Turkey, had their own civil wars, and were often ravaged by foreign invaders on top of that. In the 1640s, the crisis spread to China, while Africa was ravaged by the slave trade and jihads, and the Americas were so by European diseases and colonialism, which killed 90% of the population. By the end of the 17th century, some historians believe that the world's population was 1/3 lower than where it was at the start. The countries that lost at least 1/3 of their population over the 1600s are scary in how many they are, and include Spain, Germany, Ireland, Russia, Poland, China, the Turkish Empire, and here's a map for the rest. This might sound outlandish, but the world's population is projected to nearly halve by the end of this century, mostly due to declines in birth rate. Horrifying as it sounds, the 17th century's crisis was tame by many historic standards, in which the norm for previous crises, such as those of the 14th century or earlier, such as the crisis of the 6th century or the fall of Rome, the world's population goes down by half. The crisis of the 17th century lasted for 60 years, since the underlying demographic problems took a long time to work out. On top of this, the world at the start of the crisis was so broken that it took a lot of trial and error to eventually figure out what changes needed to be made to get the world to go function again. In the same way as this, with the way our demographics are looking around the world today, for most developed countries in the world, they're going to see declining populations till the end of the century, and the political problems associated with that with the next 60 years at least. Ironically, the countries that were hardest hit in the crisis of the 1600s, such as China, Russia, or Germany, are the very countries predicted to lose the most people due to population decline. Another valuable parallel between the 1600s and today is climate change, although in opposite directions. The 1600s were right in the middle of the mini ice age, which is the coldest period in recorded European history, which happened all over the world, where the river Thames froze over, the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey froze over, and the Baltic Sea froze over, so the Swedish could march armies across it. And this precipitated massive political problems because in an already hungry and poor population, the famines of the 1600s were one of the biggest political drivers of problems. Meanwhile, today we're seeing warming, which is probably human-driven, and we've already seen political effects of, including the rise of ISIS was caused by a horrible drought in the Middle East, as well as Boko Haram of one in the Sahel. And in the same way that climate change in the 1600s drove an already weak society over the edge, the same thing will occur with our climate change. Since both the 1600s and today are scientific modern societies, you see similar positions for science. Most Western countries in the 1600s were supportive of science, except when it trampled on religious and dogmatic positions, which is exactly the way we are today. People forget that the Catholic Church funded Galileo's research, never killed him, and he fell afoul of internal church politics, not really for anything he said at the sun. Growing up, I often heard Galileo's story as an example of how religious intolerance hold back science, but frankly, we're not any better. If you criticize trans people who scientifically don't make any sense, go into innate sexual or racial differences in most of the West, you can have literal legal action taken against you. The rights leaders such as Trump, Tate, or Jordan Peterson have all had legal action taken against them, while Nigel Farage was debanked. Don't question the church today. However, also through this era of struggle and intolerance, you also saw incredible scientific innovations. The roots of modern science lie in the crisis of the 1600s. The era's horrors pushed the most brilliant to their limits. Isaac Newton, Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, Descartes, John Locke, Galileo, Leibniz, and Kepler all lived during this time period. In the same way as this, our era has the potential for incredible technological and scientific breakthroughs, whether in AI, genetic engineering, biotech, space tech, and more. I hope to God that our Mars is the new Jamestown and Elon is our new Sir Walter Raleigh. I hope we can get another America. Maybe my kids would immigrate there in the same way my ancestors did, fleeing 17th century Britain to America. The end of the wars of religion in the 1600s made the idea of religious wars silly in the West. People looked back upon 1/3 of the European continent dying in religious wars and thought, wait, are we sure this is a good idea? This then allowed the Enlightenment and modern rationality to flower. I would bet money that the same thing's going to come out of this crisis, and that we look at the wastage and think that political conflict on the level we're doing now is silly. My worry is that this is going to be replaced by autocracy and subservience in the West, as people comfort themselves that they will never have to worry about political conflict again, since they trust the military dictator. The reason I made this video is, over the last year or so, as I've been making videos about what World War III would look like, I've been trying to figure out how a war between, say, the US and China would be waged, and what previous historical parallels we could look to. One of the so-called positives, its own twisted way, for the job I do has been the Ukraine War, in that it's been an example of what war looks like today with modern technology between two industrialized opponents. The results are beyond surprising. I often say that beyond founding religions, the most difficult job in the world is predicting the future of military technologies in war. The reality is that in many cases, the best method is just predict the opposite of whatever the general consensus is. Even among the brilliant people in the military who do this professionally, they always get it wrong. For example, before World War I, the consensus in Europe's militaries was that the offense would have the advantage in any future war. The French had a strange belief that if the willpower of the attacking army was strong enough, it could overpower any military realities. What actually happened was that the offense was nearly impossible in that war, and everything devolved into trench siege warfare. In World War II, people were still operating under World War I's assumptions that the defense would be overpowered, while the reality was that the invention of the tank gave the offensive the advantage in that war. You can even see this trend on a granular level, where people held very high hopes for strategic bombing before World War II, thinking it would demoralize opponents and end wars by itself. The reality was that if you bomb an opponent, it'll just increase their morale and make them want to fight to the death against you. What we believed war would be today is based off an extension of the logic of nuclear war. The thing is that I also believe this, as you can see in this video. The idea was that as technology advanced, war would get more deadly. You would see the exact same kind of mutually assured destruction spread across the rest of the battlefield. The idea was that all of war would become push-button, in which instinctual AIs would command lightning-fast drones, fighting wars in instants. I like to hazard some humility here, since everyone gets this stuff wrong, and that includes me. But also, predicting larger wars based off previous small wars is incredibly difficult, because people often pick the wrong lessons. The reality from the Ukraine war, as well as conflicts in the Middle East, has been the exact opposite. Warfare has regressed rather than moving lightning forward. We're going to use the Ukraine war as a test case study of the future of warfare, which, as you'll see, links back to the 1600s more than anything else. One of the really shocking things have been the rise of trench warfare. The boys our age who are fighting in Ukraine are carrying rifles in hand in a conflict not too dissimilar to how my ancestors fought in the US Civil War. Ukraine is the worst location in the world for trench warfare. It has dead flat plains that make outflanking really easy, thus destroying the value of trenches. Thus, if Ukraine has led to trench warfare, that means the historic trends really want it to happen. One of the things I find really shocking is the incredible decline in military abilities. A really big reason that trench warfare has emerged is that the Russians never brought out their tank corps in a big way. Historically, the way you break through a trench line is to use a tank offensive like knights to smash through it. However, Russia's industrial base is so decayed, they're incapable of maintaining a tank offensive and building new tanks to replace the ones lost in battle. Russia's engineering schools collapsed in the 1980s, which means they have an entire generation without manufacturing abilities. This really brings back the point Peter Zeihan's made that most countries in the industrialized world are in a process of active economic decay. Due to collapsing populations, most important countries are not seeing their GDPs stagnate, but decline. We're seeing this over the European continent, especially where it's not that these countries aren't experiencing growth, they're shrinking. This is the process of a society slinking back into a dark age. When you look at the 1600s, this was also happening. The biggest variable we have in common with the wars of the 1600s was the weakness of the societies involved. Every country with a population of over 5 million in Europe, which fought an external war, got stuck in a civil war. In the year 1645, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, China, Turkey, and Poland were all fighting civil wars. Today we assume all wars have to be total wars. Our conception of war has been shaped by the world's wars. These were total wars in which strong countries shoved their entire unified society into a meat grinder to fight to the death. However, this has not been the way wars have been fought for almost all of human history. There are two very specific eras of total wars, those being the 3rd century BC and the 20th century AD, while the rest have not fought war in that way. With a war like those fought in the 1600s, the aim was to destroy a nation's ability to wage war at all. I like to call a world war a demographic ejaculation, since they are the endpoint of a successful, prosperous, very young society. However, what happens when a society is teetering on the edge of breaking down and doesn't really want to fight the war, or the war is fought by one political faction which the other side despises? The reason the 30 Years' War lasted 30 years is that the war was a competition for how long you could wage a war before the other countries experienced total social collapse. The reason armies in that war deliberately raped and pillaged was a way to weaken the economies of rival nations until they couldn't raise money to fight. This isn't a battle to the last man like World War II, rather until your rivals inflated their currency to the point where it doesn't function. Imagine if we had a war today, or even an indirect proxy war. With the digital economy, governments would try cyber attacks to break the other country's economy. Alternately, the United States would navally block its rivals, which would cripple countries like China, or as we've already done with sanctions against Russia. One of the points I've made in this video is that we probably won't have a nuclear war, given it just isn't in the self-interest of any of the great powers. China would lose a nuclear war, and America doesn't want to kill 300 million people. However, once you have nukes on the table, it means that the total wars of previous generations just aren't tenable. This means that if war would be fought, it would be limited, like the wars of the 1600s. Just as an example, if I was an American commander in a war with China, I would try to de-emphasize actual fighting. China is completely dependent upon food and oil that comes from abroad. I would try to starve China and incite rebellions among its population. There's no way America could militarily occupy China, and an invasion would be far too costly in population. America can't afford to lose 5-10 million young men today. In the 1600s, the great powers were already in crippling debt, and then the debt from the wars compounded upon it resulted in complete financial breakdown of the world economic system. In our time, the world is the highest debt in history, and the US, the world's preeminent economy, recently nearly defaulted upon its debts. If we have a war, there's no way the great powers could pay their bills, and you would see countries default upon their currencies as their populations slide into poverty, much like the 1600s. In a war like this, you can't have a draft since you just don't have enough young men, since the birth rates collapsed and so you can't afford to pull them out of the economy. Also, your government isn't popular enough, so if you tried to have a draft, it would result in mass social dissolution and riots. Imagine if the US tried to have a draft today and pull on Gen Z. This is the generation who gets anxiety attacks for phone calls or telling someone they like them, let alone charging a machine gun. Imagine if you're a country like China or Germany, where you're already going to experience mass aging with 2 elderly seniors for every worker. In the 1600s, most armies in Europe were mercenaries. This was since mercenaries weren't subject to the laws of decency and respect that were seen inside a nation. If the Duke of Saxony raised an army of Saxons, they might be loyal to Saxony over him, and he would be obliged to them where he couldn't just hire and fire them easily. This feels very modern, where more and more wars are fought by mercenaries, even with the US military with groups like Blackwater. This is more pronounced in weaker countries where, for example, the fight against Boko Haram in Nigeria was done largely by white South African mercenaries. With aging, I could totally see countries hiring mercenaries from Afghanistan, Scandinavia, or the Philippines so as to not get involved in their internal politics or to make up for lack of young people. There's a book named The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, which was written around 2010. It has a couple predictions that are absolutely spot on and brilliant, and some others that I shrug at. I'm eternally grateful at George Friedman since he got me into this whole geopolitics world, and it was the first book I ever read on geopolitics, and made me super excited. However, one of the predictions he makes in that book that's come true, that I didn't believe when I read it at the time, was the de-escalation of war that I describe here. He said that if we had a war, it would be fought by infantry combined with drones on a small level for limited targets, like the 30 Years' War. Looking at the Ukraine war and realizing it completely vindicated what he said was a big inspiration for this video. There are 2 big reasons for this, one being that drones have helped the defense. This might vary depending upon the effectiveness of the country. Neither Russia or Ukraine have turned out to have great offensive abilities, which is pretty shocking. The US, which has legendary offensive abilities as seen in the Iraq wars, might be the exception. However, the reconnaissance and defense abilities provided by drones and automation have given the defensive a key advantage in most circumstances. Again, the Ukraine war was one that most analysts, myself included, got wrong in that we thought the Russians would win the war in weeks. Ukraine's perfect terrain for an offensive war, being a dead flat plain with no boundaries, and the Russians were supposed to have one of the best militaries on Earth. However, the fact that Ukraine has survived and stayed independent said something very important about war today. Again, war has become the exact opposite of the lightning-fast drone strike warfare that he predicted before this war. This is very similar to the 1600s, where the defense had a very key advantage. This was due to a combination of fortress construction in weak nations. I remember I was in Luxembourg and I walked along the miles of walls literally edged into the cliff of a mountain that the Spanish colonizers of Belgium used to fight off literally dozens of sieges in the 1600s, as Belgium was the most fought-over place on the planet. The fortresses of the 1600s, or the Tres Italiens, were works of art that are described really well in Geoffrey Parker's book, The Military Revolution. These forts had multiple layers, stars jutting outwards in multiple layers of cannonades. A fortress like Luxembourg was literally impossible to defeat. This defensiveness is why you see such weird geographic stuff in the 1600s, such as the Spanish holding on to Belgium surrounded on all sides by enemies. War in the 1600s was a process of long sieges while people tried to make political negotiations. My favorite video game series is the Total War games, where you fight battles in real time and try to build an empire over different periods of history. The reason I think they've never made a game set in the 1600s is it would mostly be long sieges, which makes a really boring gaming experience. The other reason the defenders had so many advantages was that no one had enough social cohesion to launch the massive attacks to break the Tres Italiens forts. Military technology made absolutely no advancements between the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, but when the French invaded Luxembourg after the French Revolution, they were able to instantly wipe out the fort. The reason for this is the monarchies of the 1600s couldn't inspire loyalty in the way the fanatical French revolutionaries could. The French could just send human wave after human wave until they took the fort. If you tried that in the 1600s, your country would fall apart. In our time, can you imagine Gen Z dying in human wave charges to expand their nation's borders? Apart from a country like North Korea, we're far too cynical and unhappy to agree to expend our lives like that. Gen Z doesn't believe in anything enough to sacrifice their lives for. The second factor George Friedman reached is that with drones, missiles, and more, the ability to maintain coherent war effort is very difficult. Modern tanks and fighter jets require so many subcomponents and complicated things that are basically impossible to manufacture on large scale. For current American tanks, there are a handful of factories around the world making tiny parts that are needed. These factories cost tens of billions of dollars, and many of the subcomponents are produced abroad, and the Chinese know where these factories are and could send a missile to destroy them in an instant. Again, lots of necessary components come from places like Taiwan or the Congo that are politically complicated and can be very easily taken off the grid. As the world gets bleaker, supply chains will start to break down. This will make the production of modern weapons impossible in most cases, thus destroying the total war logic of the World War era in which the US could churn out hundreds or thousands of Shermans from formerly car factories. However, the reality is that a single M1 Abrams tank can take out 12 World War II era Shermans. If you've ever read the Iliad, they talk about as single heroes like Achilles or Patroclus taking on dozens of opponents. That's partly for literary reasons since it's sick, but the way war worked in that era was the chariot warriors were literally so much more valuable than the spearmen, which meant that they could take on large amounts of them, but also prevents total war-style battles. The 17th century was less like this than the Bronze Age was, but it's still more so than today. There were certain units that were elite, much better trained and protected by their governments, and saved for valuable combat. When a nation wanted to break the enemy line, they'd bring out the Highlanders, Landsknechts, Hackapelita, Tercios, Janissaries, or Croats. These were warrior cultures that were much better than the competition and act almost like the rare advanced technology we would use in the next war. What would occur in conditions like this is that over time, the people who would pilot the M1 Abrams or the advanced fighter jets would be viewed as privileged. It would take on an aristocratic warrior ethic, since their equipment would be so valuable, that they would treat their fighting as an art. Sort of like how the valuable knights of medieval Europe acted, which was still a culture that existed in muted forms in the 1600s. I'm not going to say that this will result in the creation of an aristocratic society, because it's just not a big enough time frame, but if this sort of combat existed, with a small amount of advanced technology being able to outcompete large amounts of basic ones, you would see our society return to the aristocratic norms seen in medieval Europe. I know the world that I posit here isn't particularly romantic or sexy. There's a reason there aren't many 30 Years' War movies. People don't want to see the Siege of Thuringia by Scottish mercenaries serving Gustavus Adolphus, in which their waiting is to see who starves first, or will they keep the local girls as sex slaves. That's an ugly world, but also look outside. We live in an ugly world. The positive is that romantic times tend to be dangerous, and for the young men who make the majority of this audience, romantic times tend to have bloody wars. In total wars, being a young man is the worst thing since you're drafted and serve in the military, charging machine guns. However, in conflicts like the 30 Years' War, being a young man is the best thing you can be. If you fight in war, you won't have a lot of actual battles, more skirmishes, and at least you can work and take care of yourself. I feel sorry for young women, especially in periods like this. In a failed state, being in the army is the safest place to be since you'll always be fed and have medical service. The thing is that in brutal, unromantic times, rational thinking is prized. The ministers who led the nations in the 1600s were, past a certain point, largely practical men, while those in the 20th century were often ideologues. This is the way the world works now. We no longer live in the age of the great ideologies that can declare great wars for the future, like World War II or the Cold War. Like the 1600s, governments can't offer the populations anything worth dying for. This is a much more complicated and in some ways less innocent world than the world's wars. Let's look at international relations as an example. In World War II, you drove tanks until you conquered the enemy capital and then they surrendered. That just doesn't happen in the 1600s or today anymore. The American war in Afghanistan is an example, where the aims of traditional war just don't make any sense. The demographic crisis we're facing now will take decades to play out. The thing about the 17th century is that it's hard to easily split apart, with political tensions continuing over the world in some form for decades. Peter Wilson wrote a book about the 30 Years' War, where the first third of the book is just explaining the political complexities that led to the war. It reminds you of the Middle East today, where just explaining relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran would take hundreds of pages of backstory between different powers that are incredibly complicated and multi-sided. Let's say that the US and China have a war and then China falls into a civil war. The US then has to balance and manage China's civil war. Then let's say a new faction arises in China that's incredibly aggressive. The democratic problems we face are intractable, which creates a climate of extreme complexity like the 1600s. Once you remove giant set-piece wars that consume a nation's entire energies and break their will in a 4-year period, like World War I, you open up the possibility for limited wars that can last decades, and then bleed into new conflicts. The US will possibly spend the rest of the century waging some kind of limited wars to manage the demographic problems in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, or where their populations are projected to have, things could get a lot more ugly.